hopefully, apart from all the doomsday kind of issues that we have been talking about, with some hope, of course, how it is going to now give a presentation, actually, how you could move forward. And how we can use our own brains, our own ideas, our own initiatives, our own understanding to actually write a good essay without having all these other problems around.
I'm going to preface all of this by saying something that may piss off my colleagues, but I have to say it anyway. And that is that I've noticed over quite some period of time now a deterioration in really the whole academic environment. We actually know that plagiarism is a problem not just at ISS, but it's a growing problem everywhere. And I actually don't blame the students. I don't blame the students as cheats and this and that and the other. I think it's this enormous and absurd pressure to publish. You know, it's really ridiculous now. And we impose a lot of pressure on you as well to write and be quick and write. So that's I'm prefacing what I have to say, because this is important also in the way you approach things. Because actually we're encouraging people not to think anymore. And this is a big, big problem. Okay? Just do it. Just write. Don't think. You know? I mean, you can see that. You know, academics are doing the same thing. They're just writing. Maybe they're not plagiarizing, but actually in many cases they're writing garbage. You know? And we actually see it. We see it. Students also see it. Okay, so this is my attempt at, you know, holding back the tide, as it were, and going back to like 30 odd years ago, where we gave people actually instructions: think first. Really think. Don't read until you think. Okay, it's a sort of very old Chinese proverb, isn't it? You know, what's Confucius or whatever, I forget the exact proverb, but anyway, it's somewhere in there that you really have to start thinking again. And it's with that in mind that I give this instruction. And I do have to admit one thing. It was told to me by one of my students today. She had, I think she's been here a long time, and she has attended many of my study skills classes and also essay writing classes. And she says, at the beginning she thought she got it. Second year, I've definitely got it. Third year, no, now I've got it. Fourth year, she realizes every time she learns again, because now she's putting it into practice. So it's not something that is like that. You've got to really think and put it into practice. Okay, it's not going to come like that. And part of it is have confidence. Okay, because we're actually not very confident. We're very insecure. I mean, that's part of being a student, isn't it? Others have knowledge, you don't have knowledge. I'm very insecure. That's also why we want to use other people's language as well. So part of my message is also be confident. Okay, try and think, well, I've got a good brain, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to use my ideas as well. Part of this is, look, actually out there, a lot of people are just not thinking anymore. So, you know, you can make a difference by actually breaking that and starting to think. And with that in mind, I have a few basic tips. Okay, so one of my standard mantras, I repeat it. Guys, 4233, you remember I said majority of you will not answer the question. 10 groups, 5 questions. How many groups actually answered the question out of the 10 groups? Okay, I told them beforehand, you know what I used to bet with everyone was I give you 500 euros. 500 euros. Every single person in the class, I will give you 500 euros if more than half of you answer the question. It's very difficult. People just don't answer questions. They read the question and immediately internet. Okay? On the subject. On the subject. They don't stop and think, what is that question really asking me? They don't reflect on it. They don't talk to people about it. It's like this. How many of them, we had the tutorials, and I showed them, how many of you really answered the question? Well, definitely less than 50%, you see. So again, for I think the 25th year, I saved my 500 euros per student, okay? I know I will never actually have to pay it because this is one of the greatest weaknesses. Now, here is something very important. You ever want to have a chance of appealing your mark and winning your appeal, if you haven't answered the question, you're already on a slippery slope. Okay, because no matter whether you have discovered the secret of the universe, you have merged all these four forces of the universe together in your paper, if you haven't answered my question, I'm going to fail you. Okay? Or let's put it this way, I might feel generous at that moment and not fail you, but you're never going to get a good mark if you haven't answered the question. And that's the starting point, is people rush quickly. They don't contemplate, they don't think, they don't talk to others about the question. Okay, so this is very important preparation. What's the main point of the question? That's number 2. Okay, because remember, it's either 2,500 words or 3,000 words. Okay, that's the normal limits. That's not a lot. But I'm going to show you the sorts of things that the students wanted to do. They wanted to describe the whole history of an economy. They wanted to compare it with 2 other economies. They wanted to outline 3 different theoretical perspectives and the methodologies underlying all of those, and then do empirical studies of their own, all in 2,500 words. Wonderful. If you can do that, Nobel Prize is next, okay? Because, you know, this is frankly absurd. But look at the outlines. And that's the way you start, and that's what makes you crazy. Okay, when you're doing the research with that sort of outline, you're going to go insane. And if you don't go insane, you think, let me just copy and paste those blocks in there and fudge them together and hope somehow, miraculously, it all works out for me. Okay, instead, what you have to do is focus. What is the essence of this question? What is it really asking me? What is the crucial issue that needs to be addressed? Many questions are very broad. I'm going to show you examples. And you just can't manage that by getting depth. Because when I mark you, the scores over 90 are the ones that give me depth. Okay, you can't get depth when it's very, very broad. You only get depth when you focus on the core issue and go in detail. Okay, so this is number 2. Number 3 is map out your outline. And here is something I repeat to everyone, but it does fall a bit on deaf ears, is use the lectures and the lecture notes as guidelines. You know, it's very sad to me. I think, wow, that was a great course I gave, you know, a bit of ego coming in here and so on. I think I really communicated ideas. I read the essay, I know it's the first internet search item, then second internet search item, third internet search item. Anything of my lectures in those essays? Nothing. It's as if people have never attended my lectures at all. You know, and that's the problem. You know what the problem is? We let the literature dictate to us our answer. Rather than thinking, look, that guy actually gave me a lot of interesting ideas, and most importantly, I give a guidance to what is important in terms of the literature. Who should you be reading? Okay, instead, you pick the first item on Google Scholar. That person might be just an MA student like you. This might be just another research paper, or just another MA essay. And you're quoting someone I've never heard of, and no one else has ever heard of. And we don't know what sort of authority that person speaks with, you see. What you need to do is go back to the lectures. Now, in the lecture, that teacher was focusing on this particular person and saying this person was the authority on that subject, which is really important. You see, the lecture notes will give you a guide as to what is important, so what's the important issue, and who is important for you to be focusing. You don't need to read vast amounts, but you need to read the very important literature. Okay, so when you're mapping out your answer, use the lecture notes as a guide. Try and begin with the standard literature, in other words, okay, and not obscure texts. And here's my own recommendation to students is avoid committing yourself to giving original ideas and doing original work in essays of 2,500 words. Okay, because actually to do that, to actually set it up in any meaningful way, will take you at least an RP, at least. And even an RP, you're going to be lucky in some cases to manage it. It's probably a PhD. Okay, but for an essay, the trick is always to find out what the standard literature says on that issue and critically appraise it. Okay, that's the way you actually make progress. And that's the way you cope with an essay. Okay, let's just go on to it. Now, I have basically 3 sections in all essays which we need to address: is the introduction, substantive part, and very important, the conclusion. Remember what I told you about the conclusion? It's 12 o'clock at night. Peter is very tired. He's had his glass of wine. Okay, he's looking at all these essays stacked in front of him, and he's going to read the conclusion first. Okay, because I do. I always read the conclusion first, because that already tells me, is this person really focusing on the question? Okay, so that's why I emphasize that, but I'm going to give you a few more tips on that. Look at the introduction, and I've already mentioned this question, but I will repeat it. Answer the question. Answer the question. Okay? Exam, answer the question. And then focus your answer. Indicate what your focus is in that introductory paragraph. It's also very important. And here's the important part, number 3, is sometimes questions are very broad. Sometimes questions are badly formulated. We're human beings, teachers. We may not look like it. We may look like aliens, but I assure you that we're human beings and we make mistakes. Okay, and we formulate things pretty badly, but you're in an exam and you have to make the best of it. Okay, so here's the thing you do, is you actually indicate how you understand this question and how you're going to manage it by specifically focusing on this aspect. Okay, and justifying it. Okay, not trying to actually say superficial things about lots and lots of issues which are vaguely related to the question. Okay, but you get focus, and I'm going to give you some examples of ambiguous questions so that you can see that in just a moment. And then the last part I always suggest to students is give a rough indication as to how you're going to approach it. What is the structure of the rest of your paper, and what's the logic of that structure? And some students, and I encourage this, some staff may not like it, but I encourage it, is give me a rough idea of what argument you're trying to develop already in the introduction. This way I know what you're trying to say, okay? And then I like to see it again coming back in the conclusion, okay, with a bit more elaboration. But for me, this, remember, I'm tired in the evening, what am I reading? I'm reading your conclusion, but I'm also spending quite a bit of time on your introduction, because then I know whether you're thinking clearly or not thinking clearly. Okay, it's like when we read your RPs, I spend an inordinate amount of time on your research objectives and questions, and how they're organized, and how clear they are, and how delineated they are. Because then I know whether you've got a manageable RP or not. It's the same with an essay. Okay, it's very important. One practice you have to avoid is, so this is coming from 4233. I asked this question: where has most investment finance come from in successful developing countries? Forget the second part. Okay, then someone actually gives a title of their essay answering that question. In the title, I can see they're already answering a different question. You see? Profit and government intervention as the fuel of successful developing economies. I didn't ask them to explain what makes successful developing economies. I asked them what is the source of investment finance. You see? From the title, I already knew they were not going to answer the question, you know. And I already knew roughly what mark I was going to give them. Save me an enormous amount of time, you know, because then I could easily cut through the rest. An example of a question, and these are questions I have set and I have seen set, okay, and I ask it deliberately. Economic liberalization has been detrimental to development of many developing countries. Now, you know what I'm going to say. Look at those words. What is economic liberalization? It's vast, isn't it? Is it product markets? Is it factor markets? Is it international trade? Is it international financial flows? We can go on endlessly. Okay, so how do you deal with that in 2,500 words? It's a miracle, isn't it, if you can do all of that? Then, to make matters worse, I use words like detrimental. What does detrimental mean? Okay? It could mean many things. Then, to the development. Is development easy to understand? You've done your general course, you know that. Could mean this, it could mean that. And then, to many developing countries. Who are those developing countries? Can you see? I mean, 2,500 words. If I give it to someone as an RP, do you think they can even manage it in an RP? Of course not. Okay? So, supposing you have that, and you have no choice but to answer it, let's say coursework essay, one method I suggest to people is find groups of people that keep talking about this. Because there are, in the literature, okay, there is a huge literature that actually says things like that, where economic liberalization, they mean trade liberalization. And that whole discussion is trade liberalization and actually growth, not welfare. So, what you do in the introduction, you make clear that it's this particular aspect of the literature that I'm addressing. Because in principle, you make clear that all these different words would require you to do a very broad and unmanageable essay. You know, don't insult the teacher, please, because you'll be failed immediately if you insult us for asking these terrible questions, but what you have to do is find a way of using the literature to focus your answer and then give that depth. Let's just do a couple more. Okay, can spectacular growth performance of China be attributed to economic liberalization? Same point. Same point. And that is very specific because there's a whole group of people following World Bank literature that is explicitly talking only about trade liberalization. Because there's no financial liberalization in China, we know that. It's just trade liberalization. And once you can actually find that literature which keeps on focusing on that, game over. Okay, you see? You're letting the literature tell you what is meant by those concepts. And that's a very important principle, because sometimes these concepts, people feel they have to define all these words. Don't do that. Because the minute you start defining words, I'm going to ask you, why are you defining it like that? Because it's so ambiguous. Get the literature to interpret those words. Okay? And then you're just addressing the literature. You know, this is not you committing yourself. Always remember, don't commit yourself. Don't say, I'm going to do these studies. I'm going to define these words. I'm going to provide you with a whole theoretical framework. Here is a terrible one. Assess competing explanations, already we're vast, for continuing problems. What problem? My God, you know, I mean, that can be everything under the planet. Okay? Who asked such a dumb question? I did ask it deliberately. I wanted people to actually try and do an outline to it. Okay, it's a non-accessible outline, but people tried without any statement before. So we had the seminar, and people had written things, you know, incredible things. I mean, they were going to cover everything under the planet. Okay, all in this 2,500 words. And I then went through and asked them, really? You can do all of this in 2,500 words? Okay, what they should have done was said to me, this is not manageable, so I focus. Okay, so even there, this is more difficult. This is more difficult because, you know, how do you really focus? Because actually, you know, you can pick up almost any arguments and address them. Okay, so that's where it's a problem. Okay, let me quickly get on to the substantive part. And here one of the great difficulties of students is to get to the point. To spend most of your energy on the key issues addressing the question. So what I have is always, this is a standard thing that makes, you know, like when you rub your nails on a blackboard, you know what that feeling is like, you know, you go, ugh. So when students say, I'm going to do a brief background on the history of the world, a brief outline of all the theories that ever came up, you know, on economics or something like that. This is an exaggeration, but that term brief, as soon as I read, I'm going to do a brief blah, 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 I know this is blah, blah, blah. Okay, this is actual nonsense, padding. You know, not getting to the point. Procrastination, wasn't it you that used the term, Peter? Procrastination. This is standard stuff that we all do. We procrastinate. We don't get to the most important point. In the outline, make sure you have up there what's the most important issue and get to it almost immediately. Avoid giving your own views. This is again the thing. I am going to argue that. Okay, that's another standard line. I am going to argue that, or develop the argument that. For you to develop your own argument takes a lot. I'm repeating that. Okay, so these are standard lines I look for in the substantive part when I know students are then going to go astray. Okay, so brief outlines are part of that. Then try and use the literature, okay, and don't just select random articles from the internet. Okay, I go back to that. When you actually go to articles, have questions written down. Why are you reading that article? Otherwise you read line 1, line 2, first paragraph, second paragraph. It's 50 pages. It's 11 o'clock at night. You're tired. You know, how much are you absorbing? But if you read selectively, I need to read this to get this piece of information. Okay, and that again helps you not plagiarize because you've got your own structure, your own argumentation. You're just reading to reinforce your ideas and thoughts. Okay, but you're not reading for that piece to influence you directly and to condition your answer. when you present arguments, I often read, X said this, Y said this. This is not critical appraisal. Okay, X said this, I think it's a solid argument because of blah, blah, blah. The assumptions underlying this are this. Some of these have validity, others don't. Many people question the validity. You understand? I'm not saying X said this, Y said something opposite. Therefore, because Y says something opposite, that's a criticism of X. This is not acceptable. Okay? This is not acceptable practice. The same with empirical evidence. I disagree with that empirical evidence because someone else has presented another set of evidence. First, you need to look at the evidence being presented. How valid is that evidence? How did they get that information? Okay, how plausible is that? How does it support their argumentation? Then if you want to present someone else's evidence, that's fine. But it's not, you can't make counterfactual arguments like that. You can't say, this is wrong because I got some other evidence. Okay? So this is actually something that is very, very common. Many of the papers. Last section. Okay, now I repeat this many, many times, but this is out of, let's say, 20 years of teaching, I can say categorically that 20 to 25% of all essays have concluding chapters which have nothing to do with the question. Okay, and as soon as I read it, I know these people are at that 60 level and probably fail mark. Okay, as soon as I read that. And there, the main thing to do is to bring the main points you have made and show that you're addressing the question. So what is the main point you have made addressing the question? What have you found in your essay? It's easier said than done. You know, again, I repeat it over and over again, but how many times people just don't do that? And I show them and they're incredulous. Really? Did I do this? I'm going to show you an example. Then you often see new analyses being brought in the concluding section. Why are the new analyses brought in the conclusion? We don't know. But what is normal for ISS people, I suppose that's because you all come from some policy-related something or another, you're asked a question which actually doesn't require you to say anything about policy. But a Pavlovian response of all ISS students is to put something on policy in the concluding section. It actually is totally irrelevant to the answer, but you feel some compulsion, don't you, to write something on policy. Again, big problem because 2,500, 3,000 words. You see, you can't waste words. Be precise. I finished with these couple of examples. To what extent can the recent world economic crisis, you recognize this, guys, be attributed to the mercantilist policies of Asian countries? Okay, so I'm just going to show you the answer given to this. So the person writes the introduction. In answer to the question, the paper will, so they say A and B. I'm ignoring A and B for the moment, but look at C. Look at the evolution of the recent world economic crisis. Okay, remember the question is the impact of mercantilist policies on the economic crisis, and that actually is emphasized by one, possibly two groups. But now they're going to look at the nature of the crisis, okay, the evolution of the crisis. And then, look at this one. This is the crucial bit. They're going to provide an explanation of the causes of the crisis as advanced by three theoretical approaches. Why three theoretical approaches? Because that's the way I teach. Okay, neoclassical, new Keynesian, and heterodox. And I've told you before, many times, when you're answering questions, don't do what we do for pedagogical reasons. I teach like this to show that there are different viewpoints. But when you're answering a question, actually, normally what you get is a debate between two groups. One group says, well, it's mercantilist policies that caused the crisis, and then people are criticizing them. You see, no labels. Focus directly. But can anyone write in 2,500 words, D? Can anyone do that? It's such a complex and complicated thing and requires so much by way of presentation. Again, when I read that, I know, this is not going to happen. And then the substantive part. I just, pick up a couple of things. Look, number 2, explain briefly that mercantilism is not a new phenomenon, and see how it was previously pursued by the West. Can you do that briefly? And is it relevant in the first place? Has that got anything to do with the core answer? Of course not. It's just padding. And if the person tried to do it, it would be impossible. Then, thereafter, a brief outline of the other 2 theoretical perspectives explaining the causes of economic crisis. You see, the interpretation of the essay now is as if I want someone to explain the causes of economic crises and incidentally mention mercantilism. You understand? It's made it unmanageable. It's actually not answering the question. We're with problems. This is where I finish, so this is the last one. Can the spectacular growth performance of China be attributed to economic liberalization policies? Here's the conclusion. The last section will draw conclusions about the primary causes of spectacular growth of China. I didn't ask you to analyze the causes of growth of China. I asked you to address one debate that it's liberalization that caused this growth. That's totally different. To actually go and look at the causes of growth of China is a monster subject. Liberalization, economic liberalization, there's actually a very specific debate which focuses only on trade liberalization. They use the term economic liberalization to mean trade liberalization, and I've shown this in the lectures. That's your focus. And when you answer specifically economic liberalization. Now, when you're doing your outlines, I advise you, seriously, you do your outline, first cut, ask yourself, look yourself in the mirror, am I really answering this question? Have I got focus? Am I concentrating on the key point? And what are the questions when I read the literature? What are the questions I'm asking of the literature? Okay? Not starting by, let me read the literature and hope that I find some article that answers my essay question. Okay? That's the norm, isn't it? You read to see which piece of internet wisdom is going to help you directly answer that question because it's addressing that question. Don't do it like that. Apart from anything else, it could be another one of those rubbishy articles. Okay, but you have to be guided. Go to the important ones, even there, interrogate them. In the sense that, ask the questions. This is what I want to know, that's all I want to know. Have confidence, practice it. You'll never, never regret it, really, but it takes confidence. It takes confidence and you have to work with each other. Ask someone, this is my outline, can you help me? Do you really think that I'm addressing the question? Because sometimes we don't see our own mistakes. It's others who can see the mistakes. When you are criticizing someone else, you're always better at it, isn't it? You don't actually see you've committed the same crimes. That's what the tutorials are about. and you'll see it. So try and do that outside, because you'll also save yourself a tremendous amount of time if you approach this by concentrating, thinking beforehand. Good luck.